So you know how people always talk about games that were known for their graphics, or maybe just their story? Perhaps some new fancy technological aspect that didn't change the face of gaming? Well, every now and again, video games do the same thing with their original soundtrack or score. And you know what's a perfect example of this kind of thing? Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. Alright, maybe that's a bit much. The soundtrack isn't really the only good thing about Scott Pilgrim. Hell, it's not even the only exceptional aspect. This Ubisoft-published title that served as a bit of a movie tie-in is gorgeous. Graphically, it's one of the best games I've seen with my eyes in my entire life. It's modern pixel art done well, and it even stretches to modern HD TVs without that awkward blur you get from legitimately retro games. Really, it's pretty. I love looking at this game. It just plays like hell. Well, even that's hard for me to support at times. In terms of the gameplay, it's smooth, I guess. The hitboxes feel nice and merge well with the sound effects and audio. When combining the solid graphics with the soundtrack that I'm intending to discuss here, you can easily get confused and feel like you're having fun. But if you mute the soundtrack and perform several runs of the game, you might quickly realize that the actual core combat of Scott Pilgrim is really fucking boring. 2D beat-em-ups aren't necessarily my favorite genre, but it's just outright stale. The obvious comparison here is Castle Crashers, and while that game isn't any more complicated in design, it's a lot more fun, even without the cooperative element. But before this descends into me griping about the initial lack of online multiplayer, I mean, how the hell do you release a 4-player co-op beat 'em game without online multiplayer support in 2010? Jesus! Alright, the soundtrack. Damn, the soundtrack is good. Wanna know why? One word. Anamanaguchi. The amount of games which have soundtracks composed by musical groups is... okay, I can't think of any other ones. Sure, we've seen some cool stuff with music, like the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD remix soundtrack done by composers from OC Remix, but I'm blanking on similarities perfectly akin to Scott Pilgrim. If you're not aware, Anamanaguchi is arguably the most well-known chiptunes band around at the moment. Granted, that could be a blatant lie, but they're the one I hear people discussing the most when the genre gets brought up. Chiptunes is essentially music aiming to recreate and modernize sounds from the 8 and 16-bit eras of gaming, but classifying music genres in the electronic field is splitting hairs. Moving forward. Technically, this was the second proper album released by Anamanaguchi after their debut Dawn Metropolis, and followed by the very recent and gigantic Endless Fantasy studio album. On its own merit, the Scott Pilgrim OST is very much listenable, which has been a large counter-argument to video game soundtracks being considered real music to gamers and non-gamers alike. Tons of game music is good, but hard to actually sit down and enjoy when outside of the experience it was intended to complement. Scott Pilgrim's OST doesn't have that problem, and in my opinion is the better creation that occurred from this game's happening. In 10 years I won't be playing Scott Pilgrim, but I'll sure as hell be listening to the soundtrack. Admittedly, there are some tracks that aren't so good on their own. Not for lack of proper theming or composition, they just weren't intended to be ultra catchy dance tracks. Track 8, Cheap Shot, comes to mind as one you'll find yourself skipping. Meanwhile, hits like Scott Pilgrim Anthem, Rocks 300, The Dark One, and my personal favorite, Party Stronger, are near perfect examples of chiptune tracks to introduce people into the genre. Now before I head out, I would like to recommend the album Crystal Castle's Remixed Rewired. It's not completely representative of the band themselves or their 3 studio albums, but it's got a lot of variety and you might find numerous other bands to check out. Hell, it's how I finally looked into Block Party. As far as video game music is concerned, I'm completely unsure which game I'll be discussing next, but it certainly could be Armored Core 4, Warriors Orochi 2, Asura's Wrath, Command & Conquer Red Alert 3, or something else random. Hopefully you enjoyed this style of video, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking, or at least commenting with something constructive. It's appreciated.